There is a certain kind of silence that settles over a battlefield after an attack fails. Not the silence of peace. The silence of men trying to understand what just happened to them. In the last days of December 1944, in a stretch of frozen Belgian forest outside a town called Bastogne, German soldiers kept running into that silence. They would form up in the trees before dawn. They would move forward with tanks and grenadiers and the full weight of a war machine that had spent 5 years teaching the rest of Europe what it meant to be on the receiving end of a German assault. They would hit the American line, and then they would fall back, fewer than they had been an hour before, and the officers among them would sit down and try to put into words a thing they did not have words for. They had fought the Soviets in the black mud of the Eastern Front. They had fought the British across the hedgerows of Normandy. They had seen men break, seen lines collapse, seen the way a defense usually comes apart once you press hard enough on it. That was the entire logic of their profession. Push hard enough in the right place, and the enemy gives ground. It had always worked. At Bastogne, it stopped working, and the men who wrote about it afterward, some of them from the most feared formations Germany ever fielded, reached again and again for the same strange idea. That the problem was not the Americans' weapons. It was something inside the Americans themselves. Something that had been put there on purpose. Something you could not shoot your way through. This is the story of the men who did that to them. And it is the story of what their enemies said once it was over. To understand why the German army was so unprepared for what it met at Bastogne, you have to understand what the 101st Airborne Division actually was, and where it came from, because it did not come from anywhere ordinary. The division was activated in August 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. On paper, it was one more infantry formation in an army that was building hundreds of them. In practice, it was an experiment. The United States had decided, fairly late and fairly suddenly, that it wanted men who could be dropped out of aircraft behind an enemy's lines and left there to fight without any of the things a normal soldier relies on. No secure supply, no guaranteed reinforcement, no friendly units on either flank. Just the men, whatever they carried, and whatever they could take from the ground around them. Building a soldier like that turned out to be less about the body than about the mind. The physical training was famous, and it was brutal. Much of it happened at Camp Tocoa in the Georgia hills, where the recruits ran everywhere. They ran to breakfast and ran back. They ran up a mountain called Currahee, 3 miles up and 3 miles down. So often that the word itself became a kind of religion to them, a shout they carried all the way to Europe. They marched distances that seem invented when you read them today, 100 miles and more with full loads, at a pace meant to break the men who did not belong there. They were starved of sleep, buried under weight, and pushed to the point where the average man simply quits, and then pushed past it to see who was left standing. The filtering was savage on purpose. Men washed out by the hundreds. A twisted ankle, a failed run, a moment of hesitation in the door of an aircraft, and a recruit was gone, sent back to an ordinary unit, and the ones who remained knew exactly how narrow the gate had been. That knowledge did something to a man. It bred a quiet, unspoken conviction that he was part of something that ordinary soldiers could not do. And that conviction, more than any weapon, was what the division carried into battle. But the physical suffering was a filter, not a goal. What the training was really hunting for was a particular quality of temperament. The army wanted men who, when everything fell apart, would treat the falling apart as a normal working condition rather than an emergency. Men who could land scattered miles from where they were supposed to be, with the wrong equipment, cut off from their officers, surrounded on every side, and respond to all of that not with panic, but with a kind of grim practicality. All right, this is the situation. What do we do from here? There is a line often attributed to the early leadership of American airborne forces that captures the whole philosophy. The idea that being surrounded is not a catastrophe. Being surrounded simply means the enemy is now available to you in every direction. It sounds like a boast. It was closer to a job description. It was the exact mental setting the division would need in a Belgian forest 2 years later, and the training existed to install it. By late 1944, the men who came out the other end of that process were not raw. They had jumped into Normandy on the night before D-Day, into darkness and anti-aircraft fire, scattered across the hedgerows, and they had fought their way back into cohesion village by village. They had jumped again into Holland during Operation Market Garden that autumn, into a campaign that ground on far longer and far harder than anyone had promised. Handip what het einde had promised, and they had held sectors that were never supposed to be held that long. They were exhausted. They were under strength. They had earned rest. They were resting in rams in France, refitting, absorbing replacements when the world tilted. On the 16th of December, 1944, in a fog thick enough to hide an army, the Germans attacked. The offensive was Hitler's, Over the objections of nearly every senior commander who had to carry it out, the plan, codenamed Watch on the Rhine, was enormous and desperate in equal measure. 3 armies would smash through the thinly held Ardennes, the very sector the Allies considered too quiet and too difficult to bother defending in strength. The spearheads would drive northwest, cross the Meuse, and race all the way to the port of Antwerp. Cut in that direction, the Allied armies would be split in two, the British separated from the Americans, and Germany might buy itself a negotiated end to the war in the West. The entire scheme depended on speed, and speed in the Ardennes depended on roads. The forest is dense, the ground broken, the valleys deep. An army cannot simply pour through it. It has to move along the roads, and the roads in that country do not run in a neat grid. They converge. And one of the places where they converged most stubbornly, where 7 routes came together at a single crossroads, was a market town of a few thousand people named Bastogne. Whoever held Bastogne held the throat of the German advance. If the Americans kept it, the German columns aiming for the Meuse would be starved of the roads they needed and choked in the forest. The German command understood this perfectly. The task of taking the town fell to the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel, and within it to the 47th Panzer Corps under General Heinrich von Luttwitz. His corps was built around hard, capable formations. The 2nd Panzer Division. The Panzerlehr Division, one of the best-equipped armored units in the entire German order of battle. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, these were not the SS. That distinction matters, and we will come back to it because the men who wore the twin runes and the Death's Head arrived later. In the second act of this battle, and what they said when they arrived is the reason this story exists. But in these opening days, it was the regular German army, the Wehrmacht, that came for Bastogne, and it came confident they had reason to be. In the first 48 hours, the offensive tore the American front open. Green divisions and worn-out ones alike were overrun, surrounded, captured by the thousands. Whole regiments ceased to exist. The confusion on the American side was close to total. Nobody at the top could say with certainty where the Germans were, how many of them there were, or where they would be by nightfall. Into that confusion, the Allied High Command made the one decision that would define everything. It reached back for its reserve. It called the 101st Airborne. The order reached Reims on the 17th. The division was to move to Bastogne at once. There was no time to do it properly. Winter clothing had not caught up with the division. Ammunition stocks were low. Many men were still absorbing replacements they barely knew. It did not matter. The trucks were loaded, and in the cold dark of a December night, the Screaming Eagles went east toward a battle that was already going badly, most of them without overcoats, some of them without proper weapons, riding in open vehicles into air that was dropping well below freezing. There is a detail from that road march that says more than any statistic. As the trucks carrying the 101st ground east toward the fighting, they passed men coming the other way. American soldiers, survivors of the units that had already been hit, streaming back out of the collapse, some of them without helmets or rifles, some of them simply walking, hollow-eyed, away from whatever they had just lived through. Those retreating men shouted at the paratroopers as they passed. They told them the Germans had armor, columns of it. They told them the line was gone. They told them there was nothing ahead but the enemy, and there was no point going toward it. The men in the trucks listened and kept going toward the guns. That image is the whole division in miniature. Not fearlessness. Every man in those trucks was afraid, and the ones who wrote about it later said so plainly. It was something else. It was the thing the training had built, the refusal to let the situation make the decision for them. The stubborn insistence that the fight was still theirs to have. They reached Bastogne and dug in around it. The perimeter they had to hold ran in a rough circle many miles around the town, and to hold that much ground, they had perhaps 15,000 men, and not all of them were frontline infantry. A great many were engineers, artillerymen without enough shells, stragglers from shattered units who simply attached themselves to whatever hole they found and stayed to fight. Armored elements from the 10th Armored Division stiffened the defense, but it was thin, everywhere, all the time. And then the weather closed its hand around them. The cold at Bastogne is not a detail in the story. It is a character in it. The temperature fell and kept falling, down toward and past zero on the old scale, and the forest floor froze as hard as poured concrete. Men could not dig proper holes in it. When they did, the holes filled with a cold that seeped up through the body and did not leave. Wounded men who lay still on that ground for more than a few minutes began to die not from their wounds, but from the freezing. Feet rotted inside boots. Rifles jammed as the oil in them thickened. The overcast sky that had hidden the German attack now trapped the American defenders, because as long as the clouds held, no aircraft could fly, which meant no resupply from the air and no support from above. Around this ring of frozen, hungry, low on everything men, the Germans assembled the elements of a proper siege. On the 20th of December, they cut the last road. By the 21st, the encirclement was complete. Bastogne was an island. The Screaming Eagles were alone inside it, and every professional calculation on the German side said that an island leak that, cut off and outgunned and freezing, was a matter of days from surrender. The Germans decided to save everyone the trouble and simply ask for it. There was one more thing weighing on the men inside that perimeter, and it had nothing to do with the cold or the ammunition. It had to do with who was on the other side of the wire, and what surrender to men like that might actually mean. In the opening days of the offensive, up in the northern sector, near a place called Malmedy, a battle group of the 1st SS Panzer Division under Joachim Peiper had overrun a small American unit and taken its men prisoner. The prisoners were herded into a field, and then the SS opened fire on them with machine guns and cut them down where they stood, dozens of unarmed men who had already surrendered. Word of that spread through the American lines with terrible speed. It moved from unit to unit, the way that kind of news always does, faster than any official report, and it hardened something in the men who heard it. It told them, in the plainest possible terms, what the enemy pressing toward them was capable of doing to soldiers who put their hands up. For the paratroopers digging into the frozen ground around Bastogne, the equation changed. Surrender had always been unthinkable to them by training. Now it was unthinkable by evidence. They had a fresh, concrete reason to believe that giving up to these particular Germans might not be surrender at all. It might just be a slower way to die. That is the mood the German ultimatum walked into. On the morning of the 22nd of December, 4 German soldiers came walking toward the American positions south of Bastogne under a white flag. They carried a written message, and they asked to be taken to the American commander. The message was an ultimatum, formal and correct in the old military manner, and its argument was straightforward. The Americans, it explained, were completely encircled. German armored units had cut them off and pushed past them. There was, the note said, only one way to save the surrounded American troops from total annihilation, and that was the honorable surrender of the town. The Americans would be given 2 hours to think it over. If they refused, a German artillery corps and heavy battalions stood ready to wipe them out, and the note added, with a touch of menace dressed up as concern, that the resulting civilian deaths would be on American hands and would hardly match the well-known American humanity. The note reached the acting commander of the defense, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. He was, by the accounts of the men around him, tired and busy, and not especially in the mood for German poetry about American humanity. He read it, and his first reaction was a single dismissive word, spoken almost to himself. When his staff asked what he wanted to send back as the official reply, he could not immediately think of anything better than what he had already said. So that became the reply. Typed up formal, addressed to the German commander, the American answer to the demand for surrender was a single word: nuts. The German officers who received it did not understand it. They asked the American who delivered it what it meant. He told them, more or less, that it meant the same thing as go to hell, that the answer was no, that it would always be no. It is easy, 80 years later, to hear that story as a piece of good-natured American bravado, a wisecrack for the history books. The men inside the perimeter did not experience it as a wisecrack. They understood exactly what it committed them to. They were surrounded, freezing, running out of ammunition, with wounded men they could not evacuate, and no certainty that anyone was coming to break them out. And their commander had just told the German army, in effect, that they would rather be annihilated than hand over the town. Then, the ultimatum's 2 hours ran out, and the German army set about trying to make good on its threat. What followed was not a single grand battle. It was a week of grinding, repeated, murderous pressure, applied from different directions, tank and grenadier and artillery, probing for the one place where the American ring might finally tear. The Germans came at the perimeter with armor used as a battering ram, the way armor is supposed to be used against infantry who have no answer for it. Tanks are terrifying to a man in a hole. Their machine guns rake the ground. Their main guns turn a defensive position into a crater, and the natural, sane, universal response of infantry facing them without support is to give way. This is not cowardice, it is arithmetic. A rifle does not defeat 40 tons of steel, and every soldier on earth knows it. The men in the holes around Bastogne knew it too, and they did not give way. They let the tanks come, and they concentrated on killing the infantry moving behind the tanks, because a tank without infantry to protect it is blind and vulnerable, and a tank that outruns its infantry can be hunted. Bazooka teams stalked the armor through the trees and the streets. Artillerymen fired over open sights when they had shells, and cursed when they did not. Machine gunners held positions they had every practical reason to abandon, and when the position was overrun, they took it back. The German after-action reporting from those days keeps circling the same problem, and it is worth understanding what that problem actually was, because it was not a problem of American firepower. The Americans did not have more guns. They had fewer. They did not have air support in the worst of it, because the sky was closed. What they had was a refusal to do the one thing the German plan required them to do, which was break. A German assault plan is built on assumptions about how the enemy will behave. You calculate that when you commit this much armor against that thin a line, the line will bend by so much in so many hours, and you plan the next move around the bending. At Bastogne, the line did not bend on schedule, and then it did not bend at all, and every plan that depended on it bending failed in turn. The German command found itself spending men and tanks to take ground, and then discovering that the ground was retaken by nightfall, and that the whole bloody transaction had bought them nothing. There is a phrase that captures the futility of it better than any casualty figure. To gain a few hundred meters of frozen forest in a morning, and to lose dozens of men doing it, and then to lose the meters again before dark. That was the exchange rate at Bastogne, over and over, and it was ruinous. And it was being imposed on some of the best troops Germany had by American paratroopers who were colder, hungrier, and worse supplied than they were. The fighting was not evenly spread. It flared hardest at the villages that guarded the approaches to the town, the little clusters of stone houses whose names most of the men had never heard before and would never forget after. Novel to the north, where a small force held off a far larger German attack long enough to matter, and then fought its way back when there was nothing left to hold with. Foy, which changed hands more than once. Marvy and Champs and the frozen fields around them, where the German attacks came in and were thrown back and came in again. The perimeter was not a line so much as a series of desperate small battles, happening at once. Each one a place where a handful of Americans decided that this particular patch of Belgium was not going to be given up. And through all of it ran a quieter horror that the men rarely talked about afterward, which was the fate of the wounded. Early in the encirclement, the division lost much of its surgical capability when a medical position was overrun by the German advance, and the doctors and equipment that should have been saving lives inside the perimeter were simply gone. That left the wounded piling up in cold cellars and requisition buildings, tended by exhausted medics with almost nothing to work with. Men who needed surgery got a bandage and a shot of morphine if there was any morphine left, and then they waited, and some of them waited to die because there was no one who could do more. Not until late in the siege, when a surgical team was brought in by glider through the German fire, did the men inside Bastogne have anything like real medical help. Every soldier holding a foxhole knew what was happening in those cellars. It was one more reason the line could not be allowed to break. Then, on the 23rd of December, the sky broke. For days, the overcast had sat on top of the battle like a lid, grounding the aircraft, sealing the defenders inside their island. On the 23rd, a high-pressure system pushed the clouds apart, and the sky over Bastogne cleared to a hard winter blue. And into that blue came the sound the trapped men had been praying for. Engines. American engines. Fighters came screaming down onto the German columns and gun positions that had been operating in safety under the clouds, and transport planes came over the perimeter and opened their bellies, and the sky filled with parachutes carrying ammunition, rations, and medical supplies down to the men below. It was not enough to end the siege, but it was enough to keep the defense alive, and it broke the German assumption that time and isolation would do the job that assault had failed to do. Christmas came inside the perimeter with the temperature deep below freezing, and the men who could still fight worn down to something past exhaustion. The Germans chose that day for one of their heaviest coordinated efforts, an attack that briefly punched armor right into the edge of the defenses on the western side and turned the fighting house to house, hole to hole, close enough to use anything at hand. And it too was stopped. The penetration was sealed. The line held one more time on Christmas in the cold, by men who had been told days earlier that they were surrounded, and had answered with a single obscene word and meant it. Relief was by this point on its way, and the manner of its coming deserves a word. To the south, George Patton's Third Army had been facing east, deep in its own fight, when the order came to save Bastogne. Turning a field army 90 degrees in the dead of winter on icy roads and driving it north into a new battle is the kind of thing staff officers call impossible. Patton did it in days. His lead armored spearhead ground north through German resistance and bitter cold toward the encircled town. And on the 26th of December, the lead tanks of the 4th Armored Division punched through the German ring from the south and opened a narrow corridor into Bastogne. The siege, as a siege, was over. But the battle for Bastogne was not. Here is where the SS entered the story, and here is where the men who had faced the 101st began. in their own reports and letters and post-war accounts, to say the things that make this title worth its weight. By late December, the American salient around Bastogne had become the single most dangerous thing on the German map. It jutted into the flank of the whole offensive like a knife. As long as the Americans held it, the German drive to the Meuse was compromised, and the corridor Patton had opened threatened to widen. So the German command did what it did when a problem became existential. It sent in the SS. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Hitler's own Leibstandarte, the formation that carried his name on its cuffs, was pulled out of its failed effort in the north and rushed to the Bastogne sector to help crush the salient. Other SS armor followed into the fighting that ran on into January. These were not tired second-line troops. These were the shock formations of the Waffen-SS, ideologically hardened, professionally lethal, veterans of the worst fighting on the Eastern Front, men raised inside a belief system that told them from boyhood that they were racially and martially superior to the soft, comfortable, mongrel armies of the democracies. They arrived expecting to break the Americans where the regular army had failed. The fighting they walked into was some of the most vicious of the entire campaign. American casualties in the second half of the Battle of the Bulge, in the counterattacks and the salient battles that the SS took part in, ran heavier in places than in the famous siege itself. This was not the relatively clean story of a town holding out and then being rescued. This was weeks of savage, close-quarters combat in deep snow and killing cold, back and forth across the same shattered villages, as the Germans tried to pinch off the corridor Patton had opened and strangle the salient from both sides. The Leibstandarte attacked across icy forested ground with too little fuel to move freely and too little strength to overwhelm anyone. Fuel shortages alone crippled the German effort, leaving armored columns immobile on roads within reach of American artillery. Other SS armor and worn Volksgrenadier divisions were fed into the fight as the days ran into January, and it made no difference to the outcome. The salient did not collapse. The corridor stayed open. The Americans, reinforced now, but still fighting in appalling conditions, did not fold. The SS, the elite of the elite, the formations built to be the tip of the German spear, bled against the same wall of will that had already broken the Wehrmacht's timetable in December, and they broke against it too. By the middle of January, the offensive was spent, and the great gamble was over, and every mile of ground the Germans had paid for in blood was being taken back. And this is the part the histories preserve. The German soldiers who fought at and around Bastogne did not walk away describing an enemy they had beaten or nearly beaten. They walked away describing an enemy they could not understand. The recurring theme in the German record is not admiration for American equipment. It is a kind of baffled respect, sometimes close to unease, at American obstinacy. German officers had a professional vocabulary for the way an enemy defended. There was ordinary defense and there was stubborn defense, and then there was a category they found themselves reaching for at Bastogne that did not fit the normal scale. It worked in France. It worked across vast stretches of Russia. The Germans understood better than almost anyone alive that battles are won in the mind before they are won on the ground. And that is precisely why Bastogne rattled them. They had met an enemy who had learned the same lesson and applied it to defense. The Americans in that perimeter had been inoculated against exactly the kind of shock the German assault was designed to deliver. You could surround them, and the training had already told them that being surrounded was normal. You could cut them off, and the training had already told them that being cut off was survivable. You could hammer them with armor, and each man had already decided, in a Georgia summer 2 years before, that he was not the kind of soldier who ran when the armor came. The German method was aimed at a breaking point that had been deliberately removed. You cannot break that with artillery because it is not a position. You cannot outflank it because it is not a place. It sits inside 15,000 separate skulls, and to defeat it, you would have to change 15,000 separate minds, and no assault ever devised can do that. The Germans had spent a generation perfecting the art of shattering an enemy's ability to resist. At Bastogne, they met an enemy whose ability to resist had been placed somewhere their methods could not reach. That is what the SS were really saying, underneath the words in every baffled report and every grudging admission. They were saying that they had come up against the kind of strength that their entire way of making war had no answer for. And it frightened them in the specific way that a professional is frightened when his craft stops working and he cannot say why. When the accounting was done, the siege of Bastogne had cost the 101st Airborne hundreds of dead, well over 1,000 wounded, and hundreds more missing. And the wider Ardennes fighting cost the division a great deal more. The men earned a nickname out of it that they wore with a dark pride ever after: the battered bastards of Bastogne. The division received a Presidential Unit Citation for the defense, an honor rare for an entire division, and the men who survived carried the name of that town for the rest of their lives as a mark of what they had been part of. But the deepest measure of what they did is not in the medals. It is in the enemy's own words. It is in the fact that some of the hardest, most ideologically certain soldiers of the 20th century came away from Bastogne unable to fit the Americans into their picture of the world. They had been raised to believe the democracies produced soft men, comfortable men, men who would not stand when the cold came and the shells fell and the surrender note was delivered under a white flag. And then they attacked those men again and again with everything a great army had, and those men said no and kept saying no and did not move. The town held because the men holding it had decided it would hold, and no weapon in the German arsenal. Positions held past the point where holding them made any military sense. Men who fought as though the option of retreat had simply been deleted from their thinking. A cohesion in the American defense that did not seem to depend on numbers or firepower at all, and therefore could not be broken by attacking their numbers or their firepower. One senior German commander, surveying what the Ardennes had cost, put the verdict in a single sentence that has come down to us. The offensive, he said, had broken the backbone of the German army in the West. That is what the great gamble bought, not Antwerp, not a negotiated peace. A shattered spearhead and a broken back, and at the center of that failure, holding the crossroads that the whole plan needed, stood a division of American paratroopers who were never supposed to be able to do it. We should be careful and honest here because this is history and not a movie. Much of what circulates as verbatim SS quotes about Bastogne is invented, dramatized long after the fact, dressed up to sound like a captured diary. The real record is quieter and, if anything, more damning for the Germans. It is the record of professional soldiers in their own reports admitting that their doctrine had met a situation it could not solve. It is the tone of men who had spent years being the thing that broke other armies, discovering an army that would not break and not being able to explain why. That inability to explain it is the whole point, because the thing they could not explain was not a mystery, it was a manufacture. Think back to Louisiana, to Camp Claiborne, to the running and the starving and the sleep taken away, and the men filtered out one after another until only a certain kind remained. Everything the German officers described at Bastogne, the refusal to retreat, the treatment of a held position as something close to a personal vow, the cohesion that did not depend on the odds, all of it had been deliberately installed in those men 2 years earlier and thousands of miles away. The German army was looking for a tactical explanation for something that had been engineered as a psychological one. They kept measuring the Americans' weapons and the Americans' numbers because those were the things their training taught them to measure, and the answer was not in the weapons or the numbers. The answer was in the men, and the men had been built on purpose to be exactly what the Germans found so impossible. Soldiers for whom being surrounded was a working condition and not a defeat. Soldiers who had decided, each of them individually, long before they ever saw Bastogne, that they were not going to be the one who left the line when the tanks came. There is a deep irony buried in this, and it is worth sitting with. The German war machine had spent years perfecting the art of the shattering blow, the concentrated strike that collapses an enemy's nerve before it collapses his body. Blitzkrieg was never really about tanks. It was about tempo, shock, the psychological unraveling of an opponent who suddenly cannot tell what is happening or where the danger is coming from. It worked in Polsonal, could reach the place where that decision lived. That is the thing the SS could not shoot, could not shell, could not encircle, and in the end, could not defeat. Not the guns of the 101st, the mind of the 101st. They came to Bastogne believing they were fighting an army. They left having met something they did not have a category for and could not name in the language of war and never entirely stopped thinking about. The Germans reached over and over for a technical word to describe it, a cold, clinical professional term, as if naming it precisely might make it manageable. The Americans had a simpler name for the same thing. They called it the 101st.